The man slammed the young corpsman's skull into the wall. Once, twice, then let him drop like trash. He stepped over the body without looking down. "Move," he said. His team flooded the corridor, weapons raised, boots cracking against the tile. A nurse screamed. He grabbed her by the collar and threw her sideways into a supply cart without breaking stride. "Where is the storage room?" No answer. He pressed the barrel of his rifle between her eyes. Last time, around him, his men were zip-tying hands, kicking doors open, dragging people out of rooms by their arms. 12 armed men, 1 military hospital, 0 resistance. That's what they thought. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The night started the way most dangerous nights do, quietly. Corporal Danny Reyes was on his second cup of terrible coffee when he made the mistake of saying it out loud. "Slowest shift I've had in 3 months, he announced to no one in particular, leaning back in his chair at the security desk near the hospital's east wing. His boots were propped up on the console, and he was halfway through a crossword puzzle that was beating him badly. Sergeant Marcus Webb, who was passing by with a clipboard, paused just long enough to give Reyes the kind of look only career military men can deliver. Flat, exhausted, and deeply unimpressed. "You know better than to say that," Webb said. "Come on, Sarge. It's 3 in the morning. There's a blizzard outside that would freeze your eyebrows off. Nobody's going anywhere. Nothing is happening." Webb grunted. "Famous last words, Corporal." He kept walking. Reyes went back to his crossword. The hospital was a strange posting for Marines. Fort Kavik Medical Center sat at the edge of a remote installation about 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, deep in the interior of Alaska. Most of the staff were medical. Most of the security were Marines assigned on rotating duty, and most of them had the same complaint. It was boring. Nothing ever happened out here. The real world with its real threats felt very far away. That was, of course, exactly why certain people had chosen this location. Down the hall from Danny Reyes in his crossword puzzle, in a small break room that smelled of old coffee and disinfectant, a woman was sitting alone with a book open in her lap. She wasn't reading it. She hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. She was listening. Her name badge read, Ava Cole, Nurse, Trauma Unit. She had been assigned to Fort Kavik 3 weeks ago. To everyone on staff, she was the quiet new girl, competent, a little withdrawn, always on time, never caused problems, the kind of person who fades into the background because they seem to want to be there. The older nurses had decided she was probably shy. The Marines had decided she was probably boring. The head physician, Dr. Harold Sims, had decided she was probably just tired, the way all new staff were tired, adjusting to the isolation and the brutal Alaskan schedule. None of them were right. Ava was not shy, she was not boring, and she was not tired in the way they imagined. She set her book down on the table, very carefully, the spine facing up so she wouldn't lose her page. Then she tilted her head slightly to the left, the way a person does when a sound registers just below the threshold of normal awareness. She sat perfectly still. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes, which were a very calm shade of gray, moved to the window, not because there was anything to see through the frosted glass and the driving snow, but because she was orienting herself, thinking in 3 dimensions, calculating. Something was wrong. She didn't know exactly what, not yet, but 16 years of training had built inside her a kind of early warning system that operated below conscious thought. And right now, every quiet alarm in her nervous system was going off at once. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her scrubs. She walked out into the hallway, and to anyone watching, she looked like a nurse going to check on a patient. She was not going to check on a patient. 3 floors below, in the hospital's basement loading dock, the first of the smugglers had already breached the perimeter. There were 12 of them. They had come in 2 vehicles, a pair of heavy-duty cargo trucks, modified with oversized snow tires and extra fuel tanks. The kind of trucks that could move through a blizzard that would stop anything else. They had parked half a mile out and walked the rest, because the last half mile was where the exterior cameras were, and whoever had planned this operation knew exactly where every camera was and what each one could see. That knowledge hadn't been cheap. It had been purchased from someone on the inside, someone with access to the security layout of Fort Kavik, someone who had been paid a great deal of money and had made a great many promises they had every intention of breaking the moment they were no longer useful. The man in charge of the operation called himself Doyle. He had no last name, at least not one he used anymore. He was broad-shouldered and methodical, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and a way of moving through space that suggested he had done violent things in many different countries and had never once lost a night's sleep over any of them. He wore a tactical vest over a heavy thermal layer, and he carried a suppressed rifle like it was an extension of his arm. Doyle believed in preparation. He believed in redundancy. He believed in eliminating surprises before they could happen. What he did not believe in was miracles. This would turn out to be a significant miscalculation. "Alpha Team, status," Doyle said quietly into his earpiece as his men spread through the loading dock. "Clear," came the reply. "We're in." "Bravo Team? Moving to the east stairwell now. No contacts." "Good." Doyle checked his watch. "We have a 14-minute window before the next patrol rotation. Let's not waste it." He nodded to the man beside him, a wiry, pale-eyed individual named Garrett, who handled logistics and had a particular talent for making people talk. "The supply manifest you pulled, it's accurate?" "As of 48 hours ago," Garrett said. "Third floor, medical storage B. The shipment came in Tuesday. It's still there." "It better be." What they were after wasn't medicine, exactly, not in any conventional sense. Fort Kavik's remote location made it a legitimate hub for certain pharmaceutical compounds that were difficult to source elsewhere. Compounds that, in the wrong quantities and combinations, were worth more on the black market than gold. Doyle's employer had identified the shipment months ago. The planning had taken the better part of a year. The execution was supposed to take less than 20 minutes. 12 minutes in, two things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that Doyle's Alpha Team encountered an unexpected Marine patrol in the second-floor corridor. It was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. There were two Marines, young, alert despite the hour, and armed. They went for their radios the instant they saw the masked figures coming around the corner. They didn't make it. The second thing that happened was that someone cut the power to the East Wing. That someone was not Doyle's team. The lights went out, and Danny Reyes came out of his chair so fast, he knocked his coffee cup off the desk. He grabbed his radio. "Control, this is Reyes at East Security. We just lost power to the East Wing. What's going on?" Static. Then a burst of noise that wasn't quite words. "Control, say again?" More static. Reyes drew his sidearm. In the 2 years he had been pulling security at Fort Kavik, the power had never gone out in the East Wing. There were separate generators for the medical floors, backup systems, redundancies. It took deliberate action to kill that section of the grid. He was already moving away from the desk when he heard the first scream. It came from somewhere above him, muffled by floors and walls, but unmistakable, high and sharp and cut off too quickly. Reyes keyed his radio again. All units, possible hostile contact, East Wing. I need confirmation. Someone talk to me." The radio crackled. Then Sergeant Webb's voice came through, clipped and urgent. "Reyes, don't move. Stay at your post. I've got—" A burst of noise. A thud. "Contact, second floor. I count at least—" The transmission cut out. Reyes stood in the darkened corridor with his weapon drawn and his heart slamming against his ribs, and he made the only decision he could. He started toward the stairwell. He got about 15 feet before a hand closed around his arm. He spun, weapon up, and found himself looking at the nurse, Ava Cole. She was standing in the dark hallway with her hands visible, her expression completely, utterly calm, which was not the expression Danny Reyes expected from a rookie nurse in the middle of what was very obviously a hostile situation. "Don't go up the stairs," she said quietly. He stared at her. "Ma'am, I need you to get somewhere safe." "The stairwell is compromised," she said, and her voice had a quality to it he couldn't quite name. Flat. Certain. The voice of someone telling you a fact, not expressing an opinion. "They've got at least one man covering the landing. I counted the footsteps. You go up those stairs right now, you're a dead man." Reyes lowered his weapon slightly, not completely, just enough to look at her properly. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she reached past him, past his raised weapon, as if it didn't concern her at all, and picked up a radio from the wall mount he hadn't even noticed he was standing next to. She examined it for a second, then set it back. "Short-range frequencies are being jammed," she said. "They came prepared. This wasn't opportunistic." "Who are you?" Reyes said. She looked at him. In the dim emergency lighting that had kicked in from the remaining generator, her gray eyes were almost silver. "Right now, I'm the person keeping you alive." She tilted her head toward the far end of the corridor. "There's a maintenance shaft that runs parallel to the east stairwell. It comes out on the third floor behind the supply wing. How many Marines do you have unaccounted for?" Reyes did the math in his head. It took him a second because his brain was still processing the disconnect between what he was seeing, a small woman in scrubs, and what he was hearing. "At full rotation tonight, 12. I've only made contact with Webb. I don't know about the others." "The patients?" 38, scattered across floors 2 and 4, mostly stable. There are 4 critical care in the ICU on the 3rd floor. "That's their pressure point," Ava said, almost to herself. "They'll use the ICU patients as leverage if they think they need to." She looked back at him. "They don't want the patients. They want something in the supply wing, which means if we can keep them from getting it, we control the pace of this." Reyes stared at her. He was 24 years old, and he was good at his job. And even he knew that what was coming out of this woman's mouth was not rookie nurse territory. "Ma'am, Cole." "Cole, what? Who exactly?" "Later," she said, and she was already moving. "Right now, I need you to trust me, and I need you to follow my lead, and I need you to stop looking at me like I just told you the Easter Bunny is real." She paused at the door to the maintenance shaft. "Can you do that?" Danny Reyes took a breath. He looked down the empty corridor, at the darkness pooling at the far end, at the faint sound of footsteps on concrete somewhere above them. He looked back at this woman who was standing in the dim light, looking like she could wait forever. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay. Good." She pulled the maintenance door open. "Stay close. Don't use your weapon unless I say so. And whatever you hear, don't freeze. You freeze, you die. Understood?" "Understood." They went into the dark. On the 2nd floor, Sergeant Marcus Webb was not dead. He was, however, in a very bad situation. He had taken cover behind a supply cart in the corridor outside the physical therapy room, and between him and the stairwell were 2 armed men in tactical gear who had not seen him yet, but would the moment he moved. His radio was useless. Whatever they were using to jam the signal was thorough. He had his service weapon and 11 rounds in the magazine, which sounded like enough until you considered that the 2 men he could see were wearing body armor, and at least one of them appeared to be carrying what looked like a modified carbine. Webb was a practical man. He had been in the Marines for 19 years. He had done 2 tours overseas, been in 3 firefights, survived a vehicle ambush that had killed 2 of his closest friends. He was not prone to panic or to wishful thinking. But right now, crouched behind a cart in a dark hospital corridor, with armed smugglers between him and every exit, he was allowing himself one small moment of wishful thinking. Namely, he was wishing very hard that someone, somewhere in this building, had a plan. He heard a sound from above him, a soft, rhythmic sound. Footsteps in the ceiling? No, the maintenance shaft. Someone was moving through the maintenance shaft above this corridor. One of the two men in the hallway heard it too. He looked up, said something to his partner in a language that wasn't English. His partner shrugged. Then one of them went down. Not slowly, not dramatically. He simply collapsed as if someone had turned off a switch, making a sound on the floor that Webb would later describe as like dropping a bag of wet sand. The other man spun, bringing his weapon up, looking in every direction at once, and found nothing. No shooter visible, no entry point, just his partner on the floor in the empty hallway. He said something that sounded like a curse. Then he went down too. Webb pressed himself against the wall. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing moved. Then a ceiling tile above the corridor shifted slightly, and Ava Cole dropped onto the floor of the hospital hallway with the quiet, controlled landing of someone who has done exactly this before. She was holding a small, cylindrical device that Webb didn't immediately recognize. She glanced at the two men on the floor, checked them efficiently, a touch to the neck, a look at the hands, and then looked up at where Webb was pressed against the wall, staring at her. "Sergeant Webb," she said. He stared at her. He was absolutely certain he had seen this woman before. He was equally certain that the version of her he remembered, quiet, a little awkward, always carrying a paperback novel, had nothing whatsoever to do with what he was looking at now. "Nurse Cole," he managed. "Come with me," she said, "and keep your voice down. How did you, those men, non-lethal for now," she said, already moving. "I need them coherent in case we need to question them. There are at least 10 more in the building. I've identified 2 primary clusters, one on the basement level and one moving toward the 3rd floor. Webb fell into step behind her. He was 6'2" and had been doing physical training 5 days a week for 19 years, and he was almost jogging to keep up with her. "Who the hell are you?" She didn't look back at him. Someone who really wishes they didn't have to answer that question right now. "Well, I really wish I wasn't being kept in the dark while armed men run around my hospital." That made her pause, just for a fraction of a second. He caught something crossing her face, not quite a smile, but something in the same neighborhood. "Your hospital," she said. "Damn right. Fair enough." She stopped at a junction of corridors, checked both directions, then continued. "I need you to get to the ICU. 4 critical patients. If these men decide to use them as leverage, we lose our ability to control the situation." "And what are you going to do?" She reached the door to the stairwell, not the east one that was compromised, but the service stairwell at the back of the building. She pushed it open and looked up. "I'm going to find out what they came here for and make sure they don't leave with it." "By yourself?" "Reyes is covering the basement. I need you on the ICU." She looked at him directly, and for just a moment, beneath the flat professionalism and the military precision, he saw something that looked almost like urgency. "Those patients can't fight back, Sergeant. You can. Go." Webb went. Doyle was not a man who liked surprises. He had planned for resistance. He had planned for a standard Marine security response. Disorganized, reactive, slowed by the chain of command. He had planned for frightened medical staff and confused patients. He had even planned with characteristic thoroughness for the possibility that 1 or 2 Marines might be more capable than average. He had not planned for what was happening to his team. "Alpha 3, status." Silence. "Alpha 3, confirm." More silence. He looked at Garrett. 2 men down on the 2nd floor. No shots fired, no alarms triggered. Garrett frowned. "Patrol contact?" "Webb's team was the patrol contact. We handled Webb." This was after. Doyle moved to the window at the end of the corridor. 3rd floor, supply wing. Their objective was 60 feet away, and looked out at the white, howling nothing of the blizzard. Something else is in play. One of the Marines? Maybe. He didn't think so. The way his men had gone down, no noise, no fight, no radio call, that wasn't someone acting on instinct. That was controlled, professional. Get me eyes on the third-floor corridor. The camera feeds are still... I know the feeds are jammed, Garrett. I jammed them. I mean, get a man up there, physically. Garrett nodded and spoke into his earpiece. Doyle checked his watch. They were already 3 minutes over the window. Whatever it was his men had encountered on the second floor, it hadn't generated any outside alarm. The blizzard was seeing to that, cutting this place off from the rest of the world as effectively as walls. They were still contained, still operational. He just needed to move faster. What he couldn't know, what none of his careful preparation had accounted for, was that on the floor above him, in a maintenance crawl space that ran the length of the east wing, a woman in nurse's scrubs was lying completely flat on her stomach, completely still, watching the supply wing corridor through a gap in the crawl space grating, with the patience of someone who understood that the single most powerful weapon in any encounter was stillness. She had been there for 6 minutes. She had counted every member of Doyle's team that moved through her field of view. She had located the primary shooter, big man, northeast corner, good position with a clear sight line to the supply room door. She had identified the 2 men left covering the stairwell access. She had noted the way Doyle himself moved, methodical, controlled, never without cover, and she had decided that he was the key. Take down the people around him first, leave him isolated and contained, then deal with him. She had done this before, more times than she cared to count, in places very different from an Alaskan hospital in a snowstorm, in desert heat and jungle humidity and urban concrete, in conditions that made tonight look almost comfortable. Her name wasn't Ava Cole. That was the cover. Her real name was the kind of thing that didn't appear on name badges, didn't show up in personnel files, and belonged to a life she had chosen to step away from. Mostly. The mostly was the important part. The mostly was why she was here. But that was a story for another time. Right now, she was watching Doyle's second-in-command move a man into position at the far end of the supply wing corridor. She was calculating angles. She was thinking about the 4 patients in the ICU below her and the Marines scattered through this building like chess pieces on a board she was just beginning to control. She reached slowly into the pocket of her scrubs. Her hand closed around something small and hard and waited exactly right. She took one slow, quiet breath, and she began. Danny Reyes heard the commotion start on the floor above him and had to fight every instinct in his body to stay where he was. He was at the bottom of the basement stairwell, covering the loading dock where the smugglers had entered, and he had already dealt with one man, the rear guard they'd left at the exterior door, who had been leaning against the wall, half watching the storm and half asleep, and had not expected a Marine with a very specific set of instructions to come up behind him. Reyes had handled it the way she'd taught him in the 90 seconds of corridor darkness before they'd split up. Fast, quiet, no weapons unless necessary. But now he could hear movement above him. Voices, someone running, a heavy thud, and then nothing. He keyed his radio out of instinct, still jammed. He pressed his back against the wall and tried to remember exactly what she had said. Hold the basement, don't let anyone else in. Don't let anyone leave with anything. He could do that. He was doing that. Then the door at the top of the basement stairs burst open, and a figure came tumbling through, half running and half falling, slamming against the opposite wall. Reyes had his weapon up before the figure even hit the wall. He barked the challenge, the words coming automatically. Hands where I can see them, right now. The figure slid down the wall and sat on the floor, hands raised, breathing in ragged gasps. Reyes stared. It was one of the smugglers, but he wasn't armed anymore, and he was absolutely, thoroughly terrified. His face was the color of chalk, and his hands were shaking so badly they seemed to vibrate in the air. Don't, the man managed. Please don't. Whatever she is, just keep her away from me. Reyes blinked. He kept his weapon level. Whatever who is. The man just kept shaking his head. Nobody told us, he said, and it sounded almost like he was talking to himself now. Nobody said anything about, she came out of nowhere, man. She came out of the walls. Reyes stared at him. He thought about the woman in the maintenance shaft. He thought about the two men he'd watched go down from the ceiling without a sound. He thought about the way she'd stood in the dark hallway with his weapon pointed at her and looked at it like it was mildly inconvenient. He zip-tied the man's hands to the stairwell railing, checked him for weapons, found two, which was alarming, and looked up toward the noise above him. Ava, he said quietly to no one. He had absolutely no idea what she was exactly, but he was very glad she was on his side. Up on the third floor, in the silence that had fallen over the supply wing corridor after the last of the three men covering it had gone down, Doyle stood with his weapon raised and scanned the empty hallway with the focused intensity of a man who had suddenly, viscerally understood that he had made a mistake. He didn't know the size of the mistake yet. He didn't know that 6 of his 12 men were already neutralized. He didn't know that the remaining 6 were scattered and disorganized, and that his communication with them was becoming less reliable by the minute. He didn't know that the building's secondary generator was about to be restored by a very angry facility engineer who had found his way to the backup panel in the sub-basement, assisted by a Marine corporal who had given him very specific instructions. What Doyle knew was this: someone in this building was better than him. That was a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. It was not a pleasant feeling. It was, in fact, the most unsettling feeling he could imagine. He took a step back from the supply room door, then another. The mission objective was 40 feet away. The shipment was behind that door. A year of preparation, months of waiting. It was right there. He took another step back. "Doyle," Garrett said beside him, his voice careful the way a man's voice gets when he's working very hard not to sound afraid. "We could still—" "Shut up," Doyle said. He was listening. The hallway was quiet. That was the problem. It should have had noise in it, movement, resistance, the sounds of a disorganized defense scrambling to hold a position. Instead, it was quiet in the specific, deliberate way that quiet is when someone has arranged it to be quiet. Like a stage set. Like bait. Doyle lowered his weapons slightly. He had made a career, a very long, very profitable career, out of knowing when to press forward and when to retreat. Every instinct he had, every hard lesson of the last 20 years, was telling him the same thing. Something had gone deeply, profoundly wrong. He looked at Garrett. "Pull back," he said. "Now." The shipment, leave it. The word cost him something. He didn't show it. "Pull back. We regroup at the vehicles and we—" The lights came back on. All of them. Every light in the east wing, flooding the corridor with sudden, flat brightness. Doyle and Garrett both flinched. Their pupils hadn't adjusted before the voice came. Quiet, unhurried, from somewhere Doyle couldn't immediately locate. "You should listen to your instincts, Mr. Doyle." He spun, weapon up, scanning. She was standing at the far end of the corridor, maybe 30 feet away. Small, dark hair pulled back, white scrubs that were somehow still perfectly clean, which struck him as deeply wrong under the circumstances. Her hands were at her sides, and her posture was the kind of posture that belonged on a shooting range, not in a hospital hallway. Doyle had met dangerous people. He had been one most of his adult life. He understood what dangerous looked like, in all its varieties. He thought he knew every version of it. He had never seen it look quite like this. "Who are you?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Someone who's been here the whole time," she said. Garrett moved first. He was faster than he looked, which was why Doyle kept him around. And he had his weapon up and was already pulling the trigger when she moved. And she moved in the way that certain people move when they have trained past thought, past decision, into pure automatic response. And what happened next took approximately 1.5 seconds and left Garrett sitting on the floor with his weapon 10 feet away from him and an expression of genuine bewilderment on his face that Doyle suspected would be there for a very long time. Doyle didn't move. He kept his weapon raised. He was looking down the barrel at her, and she was looking back at him, and they were both very still. "Last chance," she said, and her voice was quiet and completely without malice, which was somehow worse than if it had been angry. Doyle was not a man who backed down. He was not a man who surrendered. He had never, in 20 years, walked away from an objective. But he had also, in 20 years, never been this afraid. The weapon lowered, an inch, then two. It was the longest 2 inches of his professional life. Sergeant Marcus Webb was sitting with a 78-year-old patient named Harold, who had been recovering from cardiac surgery for 11 days and had, over the course of the last 45 minutes, managed to sleep through an armed incursion, a complete power failure, and the sound of what Webb could only describe as very purposeful footsteps in the ceiling above the ICU. The other 3 critical patients were stable. The nurse who'd been on duty when the power went out, a woman named Sandra, who was 60 years old and built like someone's grandmother and had the calm of someone who had dealt with real emergencies before, had kept the hand crank monitors going and hadn't asked Webb a single unnecessary question. He liked Sandra. His radio crackled. Then for the first time in over an hour, a voice came through clearly, familiar, flat. "Webb," he brought the radio up. "Cole, where are you?" "East corridor, 3rd floor. Situation is contained. I need a head count on the ICU. All 4 patients?" "All 4, stable." He hesitated. "All of your guests accounted for?" 11, she said, "working on 12. 11. Out of 12 armed men, in under an hour, in a blizzard, in a hospital." Webb looked down at old Harold, who was sleeping peacefully, and then out the ICU window at the wall of white nothing outside, and then at Sandra, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "The 12th?" he asked. "He ran," she said. He could hear footsteps in the background, hers, steady and unhurried. "He won't get far." Webb nodded slowly to no one. "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine he will." Silence on the radio for a moment. Then, "Tell your men to stand down from critical positions. Keep containment on the loading dock until backup can get through. Given the storm, that's probably 4 hours." "And what do I tell them about—" He stopped, started again. "When they ask what happened here tonight, when they ask who, tell them," Ava Cole said, "that the nurse had good instincts." The radio went silent. Webb stood in the ICU, listening to the blizzard hammer the windows, to the quiet beeping of monitors, to the soft breathing of 4 patients who had no idea what had passed through the building around them tonight. He thought about a woman who moved through maintenance shafts and came out of the walls and talked about 11 armed men the way most people talked about items on a grocery list. "Good instincts," he said softly. Sandra looked over at him. "Everything okay, Sergeant?" Webb thought about it. Actually thought about it in the way you think about questions that turn out to be more complicated than they look. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I think we're going to be okay." The 12th man's name was Briggs, and he was running. He had made it to the 1st floor stairwell exit before his legs remembered what his brain had been screaming for the last 3 minutes. That whatever was happening in this building was not something a man outran. But his legs weren't listening to his brain. His legs were operating on pure animal instinct, carrying him down the corridor toward the loading dock, toward the trucks, toward the blizzard outside that suddenly seemed like a friendlier option than staying in here for 1 more second. He shoved through the door to the loading dock and hit the cold like a wall. The wind drove snow into his face hard enough to sting. He couldn't see more than 6 feet in any direction. He didn't care. He took 3 steps toward where the truck should be and stopped. Corporal Danny Reyes was standing in front of him, weapon raised, expression very calm. "Going somewhere?" Reyes said. Briggs turned to run back inside. The door was already closed, and there was someone standing on the other side of the small, reinforced window set into it. Someone looking through the glass at him with gray eyes that held no particular emotion. Briggs put his hands up. It was, objectively, the smartest decision he had made all night. Reyes zip-tied his wrists and walked him back inside without a word, and Briggs went quietly, with the specific docility of a man who has been completely convinced that resistance is not just futile, but genuinely dangerous to his continued health. He sat on the floor of the loading dock next to the man Reyes had secured to the railing an hour ago, looked at the ceiling, and said nothing. 12, Reyes said into the radio. Ava's voice came back immediately. Confirmed. Hold position. Reyes looked at the two men sitting on the floor, and then at the door through which the blizzard was battering itself uselessly against 4 inches of reinforced steel, and he exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. 43 minutes had passed since the power went out in the East Wing. 43 minutes. 12 armed men, 1 woman in scrubs. He sat down on a crate. He put his weapon across his knees, and he stared at the floor and tried to process what he had just spent the last 43 minutes being part of. He couldn't. He gave up trying and just sat there, which felt like the right decision. On the 3rd floor, Ava Cole stood over Doyle and looked at him with the measured attention of a doctor examining a patient. Not warm, not cold, just precise. Doyle was sitting against the wall with his hand secured and his weapon across the corridor and his pride somewhere on the floor between them. He was looking up at her with an expression that had moved through several stages in the last few minutes. First fury, then calculation, then a grudging, involuntary recognition that made his jaw tight. You were here from the start, he said. It wasn't quite a question. 3 weeks, she said. He absorbed this. Intel? Good enough. We had a source inside this installation, someone with access to security layouts, shift rotations, someone who was feeding information to the wrong people, she said. Yes, I know. She crouched down to his eye level. That's why I was here, Mr. Doyle. Not for you specifically, for the source. You were the mechanism. The source was the target. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear exactly, closer to the sick realization of a chess player who has just understood, 4 moves too late, that he was never the player. He was the piece. Garrison, he said, and the name came out like something he was trying to spit out. She didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. The name of your employer isn't something we need to discuss in a hallway at 4 in the morning. Then what do we need to discuss? Nothing, she said and stood up. We're done talking. He looked at her. You're not law enforcement, he said slowly. No badge, no federal identification, no protocol callouts, no partner, no backup. His voice had shifted, still contained but probing now, looking for the edge of the thing. Who sent you? She picked up her radio. She didn't answer him. The Marines here didn't know you were coming, he pressed. The staff didn't know. Whoever put you in this building, they didn't tell anyone. That means unofficial. That means this whole operation tonight, he tilted his head, his voice almost admiring despite itself. This wasn't a government response, was it? Ava paused for exactly 1 second. You're going to sit there quietly, she said, until the weather breaks and proper authorities arrive. That's your entire job for the next several hours. If you try to make it harder than it needs to be, I'll make it harder than it needs to be. Do we understand each other? Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Yeah, he said, we understand each other. She walked away down the corridor. He listened to her footsteps recede, and in the privacy of his own closed eyes, he did something he had not done since he was a much younger and far more uncertain man. He counted his blessings. Dr. Harold Sims found her on the 2nd floor. He had been in surgery when the power went out, a non-emergency procedure that had become suddenly, very dramatically, more complicated when the lights cut and the backup generators took 11 seconds longer than they should have to kick in. 11 seconds with a patient open on the table and the overhead lights gone dark was 11 seconds that had put approximately 15 new gray hairs on Dr. Sims's head. He was a 58-year-old man who prided himself on composure, and his composure had survived 2 tours as a military surgeon, a divorce, and a hospital administration that seemed specifically engineered to cause him maximum difficulty. It had nearly not survived those 11 seconds. But the procedure was done, the patient was in recovery, and now Harold Sims was walking the second floor with a flashlight and the tight, controlled expression of a man who very much wanted some answers. He turned the corner and nearly walked into Ava Cole, who was coming from the opposite direction. They both stopped. Sims looked at her. She looked at him. He looked at the state of the corridor, the 2 men zip-tied on the floor, the scattered gear, the scuff marks on the tile that told a story he couldn't quite read yet. "Nurse Cole," he said carefully. "Dr. Sims, would you like to explain to me," he said, his voice the particular controlled quiet of a man keeping a much louder voice on a very short leash, "what has been happening in my hospital for the last hour?" She thought about it. Not the answer. She already knew the answer. She was thinking about how much of the answer was appropriate to give. "Armed intruders entered through the loading dock," she said. 12 individuals. They're contained now." "Contained." "Yes." "By whom?" Pause. "Staff and security." Sims looked at the man zip-tied to the wall beside him. The man was not looking at either of them. He was looking very studiously at the ceiling tile directly above his head, with the intense concentration of someone who has decided that detachment from the current situation is the wisest available strategy. "Staff and security," Sims repeated. "Yes, sir." Sims rubbed his face. He had been a military doctor long enough to know when he was looking at a situation that was above his clearance level. He had been a smart man long enough to know what you did when you found yourself in that situation. You asked the questions that mattered, and you let the rest alone. "My patients," he said, "all of them. Accounted for. ICU is stable. Floors 2 and 4 were not accessed. The supply wing on 3 was the target but was never breached. Casualties on the staff side? 2 Marines were injured on the 2nd floor before I could intervene. Non-life-threatening." Her voice stayed even. "I'm sorry I didn't move faster." Sims looked at her sharply. There was something in that apology that didn't fit the rest of her. Too human, too specific, like a crack in a surface that was otherwise completely controlled. "Who are you?" he said. She met his eyes. "Right now? I'm a nurse in your trauma unit." And before right now? Something moved through her expression. Not avoidance, more like a door that was very solidly closed and was going to stay that way. Before right now is a longer conversation than we have time for tonight. Sims studied her for another moment. Then, with the particular wisdom of a man who had spent 30 years learning when to push and when to let go, he nodded. "The 2 injured Marines," he said, shifting gears completely. "Where are they?" "East Wing, room 14. Sandra's with them." "Good." He started moving in that direction, then paused, turned back. "Cole." She waited. "Whatever you did tonight," he said carefully, "those 2 Marines are going to be walking out of this hospital in a week. I want you to know I'm aware of what that means." Ava Cole nodded once. Slowly, Sims turned and walked away, and his footsteps echoed down the empty corridor. And she stood there in the fluorescent light of the 2nd floor and let herself be still for exactly 4 seconds. The kind of stillness that isn't rest. The kind that is held together by will alone, because underneath it something is working very hard to feel nothing. 4 seconds. Then she moved. Sergeant Webb found her in the supply stairwell. She was sitting on the 3rd step with her back against the wall, which was the first time he had seen her stationary since this whole thing started. And for a moment he just stood in the doorway and looked at her, trying to square the two versions of her that were existing simultaneously in his mind. The quiet nurse from 3 weeks of morning shifts and paperwork, GG she was right now. He sat down on the step beside her. They sat in silence for a moment. Intel told us the breach would happen sometime in the next 2 weeks, she said. She hadn't looked at him. She was looking at the middle distance, which in a stairwell meant the opposite wall. They narrowed it to a 12-day window. I'd been here 21 days. So you were about to be rotated out? Another 48 hours and I would have been on a transport back to Anchorage. She paused. Timing. Webb was quiet. He turned this over. The 2 men on the second floor, my guys, Carver and Tate. Yes, they went down hard. I know. And there it was again, that same tone from the Sims conversation. Precise, professional, and underneath it something that tightened her voice by a fraction when she said it. I should have been closer. I had the second floor covered, and I was already moving to the third when... Hey! Webb's voice came out rougher than he intended. He adjusted. Carver's got a broken arm. Tate's got a concussion. They're both going to be fine, and they are both going to be extremely obnoxious about the whole thing for years, which is how I know they're really fine. He looked at her. You don't get to carry that. She looked at him for the first time. He wasn't sure what he expected. What he got was just tiredness. Clean, honest tiredness. The kind that lives behind the eyes of people who have been doing hard things for a long time. It's habit, she said. I know, he said. Marines have the same habit. He stretched his legs out in front of him. You want to tell me what exactly we're sitting on here? Because I'm going to have to write a report, and a nurse handled it isn't going to satisfy my commanding officer. Your report should say that hospital security personnel and assigned Marine units neutralized a 12-man armed incursion into Fort Kavik Medical Center without loss of life and without the primary target being accessed. She said it in the flat, organized way of someone dictating. That's accurate. That's incomplete. Incomplete is fine. Webb laughed. It came out before he could stop it, short and genuine and slightly unhinged, the way laughter gets when it's been under too much pressure for too long. Cole, I just spent the last hour following a nurse through maintenance shafts and watching her take down armed men in the dark, and now she's telling me incomplete is fine. Ava Cole looked at him, and this time something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something that could become one in the right conditions. You followed well, she said, for the record. Highest compliment I've received all year. He shook his head. Navy? She was quiet. Come on, I've been doing this long enough. The movement patterns, the tactics, it's not Army. He paused. Special operations. She was quiet for 3 more seconds. Then, I was going to say former employee of a government contractor. Sure you were. SEAL teams don't recruit women. They do in the right programs, Webb said steadily. The right classified programs. The ones that don't appear in any public documentation and that I have exactly enough clearance to know exist and not enough clearance to know anything else about. Silence. You do your homework, she said. 19 years, you pick things up. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. The source, the person who sold the security layout to these people. You know who it is. It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. Yes, someone in this installation. Yes, Webb's voice dropped. Someone who's still here, right now, tonight. The quiet that followed that sentence was a different quality of quiet than the ones before. Heavier, with an edge. They don't know the breach failed yet, Ava said. As far as our source is concerned, everything went according to plan until about 40 minutes ago, and they have no way of knowing differently because we've been jamming communications since before Doyle's team came through the door. Webb sat up straight. You jammed the communications? Not Doyle's team? Doyle jammed the primary frequencies. I jammed everything else, including the secondary and tertiary channels your source would have used to verify the operation's status. She looked at him. Which means right now, somewhere in this building, there is a person sitting with a phone or a radio waiting for a confirmation signal that is never coming. And they're starting to get nervous. Webb stared at her. And you know who they are. I have a very strong suspicion, she said. I need 40 minutes to confirm it, and I need you to help me. He looked at her. What do you need me to do? Act normal, she said. Go back to your post. Talk to your people. Act like the situation is still developing. Like we still don't have full control of the building. You want them to make a move. I want them to think they still have options. She stood up, and just like that, the tiredness was gone from her eyes, replaced by something focused and still and very sharp. Scared people with options make mistakes. I need them to make one. Webb rose too. He was quiet for a moment, working through the implications. Who had access to the security layouts? Who had the kind of knowledge Doyle's team had demonstrated? Who was in the building right now? And what that meant about everything that had happened tonight in a new and very uncomfortable light. He had a thought. He didn't like it. He looked at her and saw from her expression that she already knew he'd had it. Tell me I'm wrong, he said. Her silence told him he wasn't. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. How long have you known? Long enough to be certain, she said. Not long enough to have proof that survives a court. That's why you needed the breach to happen. I needed Doyle to arrive. I needed the source to activate. She paused. I'm sorry. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you let 12 armed men walk into a building full of my people because you needed the evidence. I let 12 armed men walk into a building where I had every exit covered, every position identified, and a 12-minute advantage on their timeline. Her voice was level, not defensive, just precise. I did not enjoy it. Webb looked at the wall. He was working through something that sat badly and was going to continue to sit badly for a long time. And he was deciding whether to let it sit or say it out loud. He chose out loud. Carver and Tate. Yes, she said immediately. I know. They didn't know they were part of an operation. No, they were carrying out their duties in good faith, and they got hurt. Yes. Her voice didn't change, but something tightened in it. That's correct. And you made the call that the risk was acceptable. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Webb thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, I made the call that the alternative was worse. Garrison, the source, has been passing information for 18 months. This was the 5th operation they facilitated. The previous 4 resulted in 11 deaths in 3 different locations. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with my math, but that's the math. Webb held her gaze. He thought about Carver's broken arm. He thought about 11 people in 3 locations who were dead because someone in a building like this one had decided money was worth more than loyalty. He thought about how little comfort logic ever actually provided. 40 minutes, he said. 40 minutes. Then what? Then I hand you the proof, and you hand it to your commanding officer, and I was never here. She picked up her radio. Can you do 40 minutes? Webb rolled his neck. Something cracked. He winced. Cole, at this point, I could do 40 years. She almost smiled. It was brief and real, and gone so fast he wasn't entirely certain he'd seen it. 40 minutes, she said again, and moved past him out the door. And he listened to her footsteps go down the corridor, quiet and even and purposeful. And then he stood in the stairwell alone for exactly 10 seconds, collecting himself. Then he went to do his job. The source was in the records room. They had been there for 6 minutes, which was long enough to have pulled 3 specific files from the cabinet in the east corner and made a copy of each one using the personal device they had smuggled in, which was technically against protocol, but which no one had ever bothered to enforce with enough consistency to matter. The records room was isolated. It had its own lock, and the key was one of only 4 in the building. It was, all things considered, an excellent place to be if you needed to have a private conversation or make a quiet exit with information that didn't belong to you. The three files were personnel records, specifically the records of the three senior Marines who had been rotating through the security schedule over the last quarter. The files contained information about patrol patterns, shift rotations, and 3 months of internal security memos. The kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could tell someone exactly how to walk 12 armed men through a military installation without getting caught. Almost. The source's name was First Lieutenant Greg Caldwell. He was 31 years old. He had been at Fort Kavik for 2 years. He had a gambling problem that had quietly become a debt problem, that had slowly and thoroughly become someone else's leverage problem. And by the time he had understood the full shape of what he'd agreed to, he was in too deep to see a way out that didn't involve someone finding out what he'd already done. He hadn't told himself he was a bad person. He had told himself it was just information, just paperwork. Nobody would get hurt. He was pressing the files back into the cabinet when the light in the records room changed. He froze. The overhead light hadn't moved. The source of the change was the thin strip of light under the door, which had been dark, indicating the corridor outside was empty, and which was now bright, indicating that someone had turned on the corridor lights. The corridor lights that had been out since the East Wing power cut. Caldwell stood very still with his hand on the filing cabinet drawer. His heart was doing something irregular and unpleasant. He had heard the sounds from the upper floors. He had told himself it was the operation proceeding, that the noise was just what an operation like this sounded like. He had told himself that the lack of confirmation signal was a communication issue. He was no longer telling himself these things. He moved to the door. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing from outside. He looked through the keyhole. Empty corridor. He put his hand on the door handle. He could feel his own pulse in his palm. He opened the door. Ava Cole was standing directly in front of him, 3 feet away, hands at her sides, gray eyes completely calm. Caldwell took 1 step backward. "Greg," she said. His stomach dropped through the floor. "The copy you just made," she said, "is on a device that's been logging every keystroke and every file access for the last 21 days. I've had a mirror of everything on that device since your 2nd week here." She tilted her head. "So the files you just copied? I already have them. I already have everything." He opened his mouth. "The money," she continued, "was traced back through 4 accounts to a holding company registered in a state you've never visited, which connects to an individual whose name you know as Mr. Garrison, and who your bank records will demonstrate paid you $140,000 over 18 months. He closed his mouth. "The door behind you is the only exit from that room," she said. "The corridor behind me leads to the East Wing security station, where Sergeant Webb is currently waiting." She didn't move, didn't step closer, just watched him with the calm of someone for whom this exact moment, this precise intersection of evidence and acknowledgement, and the specific silence of a person realizing there is nowhere left to go, was familiar territory. You can make this easier or harder. That choice is genuinely yours. Caldwell stood in the doorway of the records room with 3 copied files on a device in his pocket and debt that had metastasized into treason, and looked at this woman in nurse's scrubs who had just quietly dismantled every assumption he had been holding himself together with for 18 months. He made the choice. He sat down on the floor. Right there, in the doorway, he simply sat down and put his face in his hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Ava Cole stood and let him. She was in no hurry. The blizzard outside wasn't stopping for another 3 hours, and she had exactly as long as she needed. After a while, Caldwell looked up. His eyes were red. His voice, when it finally came, was small in the particular way voices get when a person has stopped performing and is just left with themselves. "How long have you known it was me?" 11 days, she said. He absorbed this. "But you waited." "I needed Doyle." I needed the activation. Without the operation actually occurring, what I had was circumstantial. She paused. I needed you to make a move. He stared at her. The breach. You let it happen. You let those men in. I controlled it. Carver and Tate got hurt. The silence was short but absolute. Yes, she said. They did. Something in his expression shifted. Not absolution for himself, but something close to the look of a man who has just realized the full weight of what his choices cost people who had nothing to do with his choices. It was not a comfortable look. Good, some part of Ava Cole thought. Discomfort was honest. What happens now, he said. Now you stand up, she said, and you walk with me to the security station, and you tell Sergeant Webb everything. And that's where my part ends. He stood up, slowly, like someone for whom standing had become a symbolic act rather than a physical one. He looked at her. Who are you? She had been asked this question 4 times tonight, by a corporal, by 2 sergeants, and by a man who had nearly destroyed this installation from the inside out. She had deflected every time, had given the non-answer, the redirect, the professional quiet that served as its own kind of wall. She looked at Caldwell for a moment, at the specific quality of his collapse, which was real and human, and had none of the calculation left in it that characterized most of the other men she had dealt with tonight. Someone who was where you are once, she said. His eyes moved to hers. Not the treason part, she said flatly. The part where you were in so deep you couldn't see the surface anymore. She stepped back from the doorway. Walk. He walked, and she followed behind him down the lit corridor of Fort Kavik Medical Center, through the strange, suspended quiet of a building that was slowly, cautiously beginning to remember what normal felt like, toward the East Wing security station and Sergeant Webb, and the beginning of the long unwinding of everything tonight had been. Webb was at the security station when they came through the door. He saw Caldwell's face first and knew immediately. Not from guilt. Guilt was something people wore differently, some loud and some quiet, and some so buried you'd never find it without a shovel. What he saw on Caldwell's face was simpler and worse than guilt. It was relief, the specific, hollow relief of a man who has been holding something so heavy for so long that when it finally drops, the absence of weight feels almost like peace, even when everything else is in ruins. Webb had seen that face before, on the other side of a table in a JAG proceeding, on a man who had been his friend for 6 years. He had hoped, very sincerely, that he would never see it again. Sit down, Greg, he said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The voice he used when he needed to be a sergeant more than he needed to be a human being. Caldwell sat. Webb looked at Ava. She set a small device on the desk in front of him without a word. He looked at it. Then he looked back at her. She gave him one small nod that communicated everything a full briefing would have taken an hour to say. Webb picked up the device. He looked at Caldwell. You're going to talk to me, he said. All of it, from the beginning. Caldwell opened his mouth, and he talked. Ava didn't stay for the full accounting. She didn't need to. She had heard the beginning of it, the first careful sentences in which Caldwell described a debt that had started as a number and grown into something that had its own gravity, pulling everything around it toward a center he'd never meant to find himself at. She knew the shape of the rest. She had read enough case files, sat across from enough people in enough rooms, to know how these stories went once the first domino fell. She left Webb to it and walked back toward the East Wing alone. The hospital had a different quality now. Not safe, exactly. The 12 men were secured but not transferred. The blizzard was still hammering every exterior wall, and the nearest law enforcement was 4 hours away on roads that might not exist anymore under 6 feet of drifting snow. But the specific quality of threat that had been in the air since 3 in the morning had lifted, the way pressure lifts after a storm passes. And what replaced it was something quieter and more complicated. She passed room 14. Through the small window in the door, she could see Sandra at the bedside of the man with the broken arm, Carver, who was awake and talking. His face was pale and his arm was immobilized, and he was clearly in pain, but he was talking, and from the way Sandra was responding, it was the kind of talking that involved strong opinions about the quality of the hospital's coffee, which was, all things considered, a very good sign. Ava stopped walking. She stood at that window for a moment longer than she intended to. Carver was 22, 23 at most, with the kind of face that still looked like it was figuring out what it was going to settle into. He hadn't signed up for tonight. None of them had. They were security detail at a remote medical installation in the middle of Alaska, and their biggest concern 3 hours ago had been the crossword puzzle, and the coffee, and the slow, boring wait of a quiet night. She moved on before he could look up and see her. There was a particular discipline required for this part of the work, not the operational part. That part she had trained for until it was reflex, until it lived in her body without needing her permission. The other part, the part where you looked at the collateral and calculated it against the outcome and decided the math worked. And then you carried the math afterward in the part of yourself that math never quite satisfied. She had been carrying a lot of math for a long time. The break room was empty. She sat down at the same table where she had been sitting when this whole thing started, 4 hours ago, with the unread book and the sense that something was wrong. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at them for a moment, steady, unremarkable, the hands of a person who happened to work in a hospital. Her real name was not Ava Cole. The file that said it was had been created by people who were very good at creating files, and it had backstory and references, and a photograph and a history that all cohered beautifully. She had lived inside that file for 21 days and had been, to the best of her knowledge, entirely convincing. Her real name was something she hadn't said out loud in over a year. She was 38 years old. She had spent 16 of those years in service to her country in ways that required, by their nature, the systematic dismantling of the kind of selfhood that most people spent their lives building. Not overnight, it happened in increments. A name changed here, a history adjusted there, an identity worn like clothing until the clothing and the person inside it became indistinguishable. And then the clothing changed again, and you adjusted again, and eventually you stopped asking which version of yourself was the real one, because the question had become genuinely, practically unanswerable. She had left that life 14 months ago, mostly. The mostly was sitting in a Doyle-shaped pile on the 3rd floor. She picked up the book she had left on the table 4 hours ago. It was still open to the same page. She looked at the words without reading them, and she sat with the specific silence of a person who is very used to being alone and has long since stopped confusing that for being at peace. The door opened. She didn't startle. She had heard the footsteps in the corridor 30 seconds ago. Danny Reyes came in. He was carrying 2 mugs of coffee, which impressed her because the fact that he had located and operated a coffee maker in the middle of a post-breach security lockdown suggested a level of practical resourcefulness she appreciated. He set 1 mug in front of her and sat across the table with the other, and for a moment they just sat there in the mutual silence of 2 people who had spent the last 2 hours in each other's peripheral vision without having a single normal interaction. "The basement is secured," he said. "I know. Webb's got Caldwell at the station." "I know." Reyes wrapped both hands around his mug. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working up to something, the way young men do when they want to ask a serious question and aren't sure they're entitled to the answer. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Were you scared? Any point tonight, any part of it?" She considered the question honestly. It deserved that. "Yes," she said. He looked surprised. "When?" "When I came through the maintenance shaft above the 2nd floor, and I heard your radio cut out, and I didn't know yet where you were." She looked at her mug. "That 30 seconds before I reestablished your position." Reyes was quiet, processing. Fear isn't the problem, she said. It's information. It tells you what matters. She paused. The problem is when it tells you wrong. He nodded slowly. He was turning the mug in his hands, around and around, the small, repetitive motion of a person whose body needs something to do while their mind is working. Garrett, he said, the one you put down in the third-floor corridor, he was going to shoot. Yes. You moved before he finished pulling the trigger. Yes. How do you... He stopped, reorganized. How do you train for something like that? To move that fast when someone's already aiming at you? She looked at him directly. He was 24 years old, and he was sitting across from her at 4 in the morning in a break room that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. And he had done his job tonight with more composure than people twice his age. He had followed her into a maintenance shaft in the dark, based on nothing but 3 sentences of instruction and the decision to trust a stranger. He deserved a real answer. You don't train for the speed, she said. The speed is a result. You train for the decision to happen before you have to think about it. You put yourself in the situation enough times, controlled, then less controlled, then not controlled at all, until the decision isn't conscious anymore. She paused. It's not a gift. It's just repetition. A very specific, very uncomfortable kind of repetition. Reyes absorbed this. How long did it take you? 8 years before I trusted it. 11 before I stopped questioning it afterward. He nodded, and she could see from his expression that he was filing it away. Not just the content of the answer, but the shape of it. The implication of what a timeline like that meant about the life that had produced it. You were really a SEAL, he said. Not accusatory, almost careful the way you state something aloud when you're trying to make it real. She looked at him steadily, said nothing. Right, he said. Former employee of a government contractor. Sharp kid, he almost smiled. Corporal, he corrected. Sharp corporal. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The blizzard pressed against the windows with steady, mindless force. Somewhere above them, 12 men were waiting in zip ties for a weather system to break, and a man named Caldwell was telling Sergeant Webb the shape of a mistake that had taken 18 months to fully metastasize, and 4 patients in the ICU were sleeping through the longest night Fort Kavik Medical Center had ever had. Reyes set his mug down. What happens to you after tonight? What do you mean? I mean, he chose his words carefully. You handled this whole thing. You came in here 3 weeks ago with a cover and a target and a plan, and you executed it, and now it's done. And in 4 hours when the backup arrives and they process everything and it all goes up the chain, he met her eyes. What happens to you? It was a better question than he probably knew. She turned it over. I write a report, she said. The report goes to people who read it and act on it. Garrison gets taken apart. The network that used Doyle gets identified and handled. Caldwell goes through the military justice system. She paused. And I go somewhere else. Just like that. Just like that. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite sadness, more like the specific dissatisfaction of someone who has just been told that a story ends not with a door closing, but with a person simply walking out of frame. And nobody here knows what you did. The report will say that hospital security and Marine units. I know what the report will say. His voice had an edge to it now, young and genuine and refusing to be managed. I'm saying nobody here will know. You came into this building and you protected people who didn't even know they needed protecting. And when it's over, you just disappear. And everybody goes home and nobody says your name. She looked at him for a long moment. Danny, she said, and she used his first name the way she had specifically not used it all night, because she had known that names were their own kind of dangerous in work like this, their own kind of tether. That's the job. That's a terrible job. Yes, she said simply. Sometimes it is. The honesty of it seemed to land on him differently than a deflection would have. He sat with it, the mug in his hands, the fluorescent light overhead, the blizzard outside. "I'm going to remember this night for the rest of my life," he said. "I know. And I won't be able to tell anybody what actually happened." "Probably not." He looked at the table, then back up. "That feels wrong." "It is what it is," she said. Then, after a pause, "But you handled yourself tonight, Corporal. Independently of everything else, you made good decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, and you trusted your instincts when it counted. That's not nothing. That's actually most of it." He held her gaze. She could see the thing he wanted to say working its way to the surface. Something about fairness, probably, or recognition, or the basic human frustration of knowing that the real version of a story will never be the public version. She had felt that frustration herself once. For years, actually. She understood every word of it. Before he could say it, her radio crackled. Webb's voice. "Cole, I need you at the station." She stood, picked up the radio. "On my way." She looked at Reyes. "Good work tonight, Corporal." He nodded. Something settled in his face. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of it. The kind that comes from deciding to carry something gracefully rather than not carry it at all. She left him with the coffee and the quiet and the blizzard. Webb was not alone at the security station. Caldwell was still there, sitting in the corner with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floor. But beside Webb, standing with the rigid posture of a man who has recently been subjected to information that has rearranged his understanding of the last several hours, was a face Ava had seen only in photographs. Colonel James Harwick, Fort Kavik's commanding officer. He was 54 years old, built like a man who had never entirely stopped being a linebacker, with silver hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved specifically to communicate authority. He had been in his quarters on the far side of the installation when the breach began, had been alerted by a junior officer who had finally managed to get through on one of the unjammed frequencies, and had arrived at the security station 7 minutes ago to find his sergeant sitting across from a treason case and a device full of evidence that painted a very specific and very ugly picture of the last 18 months. He looked at Ava when she came through the door with the directness of a man who is used to looking at things he doesn't fully understand and deciding within seconds how to classify them. "Nurse Cole," he said. His voice was the controlled baritone of command, the voice that had given orders in bad situations and had them followed. "Colonel, Sergeant Webb has been briefing me." He didn't move from where he stood. "On the operational details he is aware of." "Yes, sir." "There are gaps." "Yes, sir." He looked at her steadily. "I have clearance level 4. She met his eyes. "I know. And the operation you were running in my installation falls under a classification tier above 4, she said. "Yes." The muscles in his jaw moved. She could see him processing this. The specific frustration of a commanding officer who has had an active, covert operation running inside his command without his knowledge, which was both standard procedure under certain circumstances and a completely understandable source of anger. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that someone ran a classified operation through my hospital, used my personnel as operational assets without their knowledge, and I had no clearance to be informed." "That's correct." "And you see nothing problematic about that?" "I see several problematic things about it," she said. "I wasn't the one who made that call." His eyes narrowed, not with anger exactly, more with the particular attention of a man who has just heard something he didn't expect. "No. The decision to keep command uninformed came from above my level," she said. "I was given a cover, an objective, and a timeline. The operational architecture above that wasn't mine to design." Harwick was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his assessment of her, a recalibration. She had seen it before. People expected either defiance or deference from people in her position, and what she was giving him was neither. Just the clean, factual account of what had happened, and who had made which decisions, and where her responsibility began and ended. Garrison, he said, the name Caldwell gave. Yes, you know this individual. I know enough. Is Garrison military or civilian? She paused. Colonel, the full picture on Garrison is going to come through your chain of command within the next 12 hours. Once the weather clears and communications are restored. Everything I know is in the report that gets filed with my debrief, and that report will be routed to every relevant party with appropriate clearance. She held his gaze. What I can tell you tonight is that the threat to your installation is contained. The source has been identified and is in your custody, and the network that used him to target Fort Kavik is no longer operational. Harwick looked at her for a long time. My men, he said, Carver, Tate, recovering, non-life-threatening injuries. He absorbed this too. The muscles in his jaw released slightly. You protected this installation. Your men protected it, she said. Webb, Reyes, your security staff. I provided support. He almost laughed. It didn't quite make it to his face, but she saw it try. Nurse Cole, he said, I have been a Marine for 31 years, and I can tell the difference between support and the person holding the whole thing together. He looked at Webb. Can't I, Sergeant? Webb, from the other side of the room, said, That would be my assessment, sir. Harwick looked back at something in his expression had settled into a respect that was specific and earned, and not at all perfunctory. The kind of respect that only moves in one direction, from one professional to another, when the evidence is undeniable. Is there anything you need from me before the weather breaks? She considered. A secure channel for a single transmission, encrypted. I need to report status to my handler. You'll have it. He turned to Webb. Sergeant, make it happen. Yes, sir. Harwick took one step toward the door, then stopped. Without turning back, he said, The report, the official one, it'll say security personnel and assigned units contain the breach. That's my understanding. Your name won't appear. No, sir. He stood there for a moment, his back to her. She could see the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man choosing his next words from among several options, each one carrying a different weight. I won't pretend, he said, that I'm entirely at peace with the way this was handled. The operational security justifications aren't lost on me. But 11 people, he paused, 11 people in this building are going home because of what happened tonight. That's a number I intend to keep. He walked out. The room was quiet. Caldwell, from his corner, said nothing. He was looking at the floor, and the floor was not giving him anything back, which was exactly what he deserved, and he seemed to know it. Webb stood up and moved to the communications panel. He worked in silence for a moment, then looked back at Ava. Secure channels up, 2 minutes on the clock. She nodded, picked up the handset, pressed the transmit key. 2 rings, then a voice she hadn't heard in 3 weeks. Careful, measured with the particular quality of someone who conducts their entire professional life in the space between what is said and what is meant. Report. Objective achieved, she said. Primary target secured. Documentation complete. Secondary breach network neutralized. She paused. Garrison activation confirmed. Evidence chain intact. A short silence on the other end. Casualties? 2 Marine personnel, non-life-threatening. No fatalities. Another silence. Longer. She had worked with this voice for 6 years, and she could read its silences the way other people read faces. This one was doing math. Specific, unsentimental math. Good work, the voice said. She almost said something. The something sat at the edge of her tongue for exactly 1 second. Something about Carver's arm and Tate's concussion, and the 30 seconds over the maintenance shaft when Reyes's radio went silent and she hadn't known. Something that the voice on the other end would understand as data, as operational feedback, as parameters for the next mission in a building like this one, in a situation like this one. She didn't say it. Extraction timeline, she said instead. Weather window opens at 0700, transport at 08. Confirmed. She looked at the clock. 2 hours and 40 minutes. Anything else? Stand by for final confirmation on Garrison's location. We may need you on site for the secondary operation. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I'm listening. Garrison moved 48 hours ago. New location is not Alaska. The voice gave her a city, a country, 7 time zones away. She set the handset down. She stood with her hands still on it for a moment, looking at nothing. Webb was watching her. New assignment? Possibly. Before you've slept. Sleep is a transport problem, she said. I'll handle it. He shook his head slowly. Not judgment, more like the involuntary response of a person watching something that is impressive and exhausting and slightly heartbreaking all at once. You know, he said, at some point the job has to end. She looked at him. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, he said. I'm just saying it out loud, because I think sometimes people in your position need to hear it from someone who isn't in your position. She picked up her radio from the desk. She checked the battery level with the automatic efficiency of someone who checks battery levels the way other people check the time, constantly, without thinking. She looked at Webb, who was 51 years old and had 19 years of service and 2 injured men in room 14 and a treason case in the corner of his security station, and who was still finding the time and the basic human generosity to say something true to a stranger. How long have you been married? She asked. He blinked at the pivot. 23 years. Same woman? Deeply insulted by that question, but yes. That's how you know the job ends, she said. When you have a thing that the job can't be. She said it without weight, without self-pity, just as a fact, the way she stated most facts. I'm working on it. Webb looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression went quiet and careful and kind. He didn't push it further. He knew better than to push something like that further. 2.5 hours to extraction, he said. 2.5 hours, she confirmed. She walked out of the security station, into the lit corridor, past room 14, where Carver was now asleep and Sandra had moved on to checking Tate's vitals, past the break room where Reyes had finished his coffee and was back at his post, past the stairwell where 2 hours ago the whole night had pivoted on a decision to trust a stranger in the dark. She walked to the window at the end of the East Wing corridor and looked out at the blizzard. It was still going, full force, full fury, absolutely indifferent to everything that had happened inside the walls it was pressing against. 5 feet of snow and a wind that could knock a man sideways. The world outside was white and violent and completely without mercy. She put her hand flat against the cold glass. 2.5 hours, then a city, a country, 7 time zones away. A man named Garrison, who had moved 48 hours ago and didn't know yet that the chain of evidence connecting him to everything tonight was already complete and already filed and already irreversible. She stood at the window and looked at the storm and felt, in the very specific and well-practiced way she had learned to feel things in the spaces between operations, the full weight of the last 4 hours. Not crushing, not overwhelming, just present, real. The way the cold was real through the glass against her palm. She allowed it exactly 60 seconds. Then she straightened up, pulled her hand from the glass, turned away from the window. There was work left to do, and she had never in her life left work unfinished. The 2.5 hours before extraction were supposed to be quiet. They were not quiet. The first thing that happened was that Doyle started talking. Not to Webb, who was the logical person to talk to, not to Colonel Harwick, who had the authority. Doyle started talking to the wall, which is to say, he started talking to the Marine standing guard in the corridor outside the room where he'd been secured. And he talked with the steady, deliberate persistence of a man who understood that information was the only currency he had left, and that currency had a very short shelf life. The Marine standing guard was a 26-year-old specialist named Cortez, who had been on the fourth floor when the breach started and had spent most of the last 2 hours cycling between confusion and adrenaline and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been keyed up for a crisis that kept changing shape. Cortez was not supposed to engage. Cortez knew he was not supposed to engage, but Doyle had been doing this for 20 years, and he knew exactly which words to use on a young soldier standing alone in a corridor at 5 in the morning with too much information bouncing around in his head and nobody to process it with. "The nurse," Doyle said through the door, "the one who handled my team. You've been with her all night and you still don't know who she really is." Cortez said nothing. "I do," Doyle said. Cortez said nothing, but he didn't walk away either, and Doyle heard that. "Not her name," Doyle continued. "Names gay don't matter in her world, but what she is, what she was built for, who built her." A pause. "You think tonight was the first time she's done something like this?" "I'm not authorized to discuss." "I'm not asking you to discuss anything," Doyle said, his voice patient and almost gentle. "I'm telling you something. For free, no conditions." Another pause. "The program she came out of, they don't just send people like her to protect hospitals in Alaska. They send them when the thing they're protecting is worth more than the building." Cortez shifted his weight. "Sir, you need to stop talking." "The supply wing," Doyle said. "You really think a pharmaceutical shipment is worth a 12-man operation and a year of planning?" Cortez stopped shifting. "Think about what else comes through a remote military medical installation," Doyle said. "What else gets shipped to a facility this far off the grid, this far from oversight, with this specific security configuration?" His voice was completely even, almost academic. "Think about it, son. Then ask yourself why a classified operative was embedded here 3 weeks before we arrived." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Ava's voice came from directly behind Cortez, quiet and immediate. "Walk away, Cortez." He startled hard, spun around to find her standing 6 feet behind him in the corridor. How long she had been there, he had absolutely no idea. Long enough. Her face told him nothing except that she had heard everything. "Ma'am, he's doing his job," she said, "which is to find a crack and put pressure on it. Walk away before he finds yours." Cortez walked. Fast, with the focused purposefulness of someone who has just been reminded that the ground they're standing on is less solid than it appeared. Ava G.K. stood in front of the door. On the other side, Doyle was quiet. She could feel him being quiet, the specific quality of a man recalibrating. She gave him 10 seconds. "Smart," he said. "I almost had him." "You didn't almost have him," she said. "You had 12 seconds before I got here. You were warming up." A short pause. "You were listening from the stairwell." "I was listening from the moment you started." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "What's in the supply wing, Cole?" "Pharmaceuticals." "Don't insult me." She put her hand flat on the door, not threatening, just present. "Doyle, you spent a year building an operation to hit this installation. Whatever your employer told you was in that supply wing, whatever number they put on it to make the risk worth taking. I want you to understand something." She paused. "They were using you. The shipment was real. The value was real. But you were never going to leave Alaska with it." Silence. "Garrison," she said, "your source inside this installation. You paid him. Your employer paid him. And your employer was going to pay someone else to intercept the shipment from you once you'd done the hard work of getting through the security." She let that sit for a moment. "You were the mechanism, Mr. Doyle. I told you that 2 hours ago. The person who hired you had no intention of splitting the take." The silence on the other side of the door was a different quality now, heavier. She could almost hear him processing it, the specific, grinding recalculation of a man realizing that the people who used him as a tool had planned for the tool to be discarded. "Garrison," Doyle said slowly, Garrison was going to flag our exit route. There were 3 vehicles waiting on the highway access road, she said. Not yours. They've been there since yesterday morning. She waited. Your employer has a pattern. This is the 3rd time he's run this exact play. Different location, different mechanism, same outcome. Another silence. Then, you've been tracking him for a while. Long enough. And I walked right into it. You walked into it because the intelligence you were given was designed to be walked into. She pulled her hand from the door. For what it's worth, the planning was excellent. Your team was professional. Under different circumstances, don't, he said. His voice had gone flat. Not angry, just stripped of the last pretense. Don't finish that sentence. She didn't. Garrison, he said after a moment. He's in custody. Yes. Is he going to give up Garrison's real name? The employer. She thought about Caldwell, about the hollow relief on his face when he sat down on the floor of the records room doorway, about the way some people, when they finally stop running, run all the way to the truth. Yes, she said, he is. A very long pause. Then you don't need me, Doyle said. I never needed you for information, she said. I needed you for evidence, and I have it. She walked away from the door. Behind her, she heard nothing from Doyle. Not protest, not argument, not the sound of a man who had any move left to make. Just silence, which was the loudest thing he could have said. She found Webb in the corridor outside the ICU with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by things approximately 40 minutes ago and was now simply running on professional momentum and caffeine. Doyle was working Cortez, she said. I heard. Webb tilted his head toward the security station. Cortez is fine. I talked to him. He's a good kid. He's a good kid who needed something to hold on to, she said. Doyle found the handle. That's what Doyle does. She looked at the ICU door. How are they? Carver's in and out. Tate's awake and currently trying to convince Sandra that he's well enough to return to duty, which Sandra is handling with the energy of a woman who has heard that particular argument from 23-year-old men approximately 400 times. Despite everything, something loosened slightly in Ava's chest. Tate should know better than to argue with Sandra. Tate is 23 and has a concussion. He doesn't know anything right now. Webb looked at her. You told Doyle about the intercept vehicles. Yes. That wasn't in the brief you gave me. No. He was quiet, working something through. The 3 vehicles on the highway access road, how long have you known about them? 72 hours. Webb absorbed this. You knew Garrison intended to double-cross Doyle's team. I knew Garrison's employer did, and you didn't? He stopped, collected himself. There were 3 vehicles, presumably with personnel. 4 individuals per vehicle, she said. 12 additional operatives. The number landed on Webb like something physical. He straightened up. There were 12 men already inside this building. You're telling me there were 12 more waiting outside to, what, hit Doyle's team on the exit? Intercept the shipment, she said. Eliminate the team. Leave nothing traceable back to Garrison's employer. 24 total operatives targeting this installation. Yes, he looked at her. His GDK when it came was very controlled. Cole, the GDK outside, what happened to? Before Doyle's team entered the building, I transmitted a specific frequency signal on the channel Garrison's employer was using to coordinate the intercept vehicles. She held his gaze. That signal indicated the operation had GDK standard exfil protocol for the network. They were 2 miles from this installation when they turned around. Webb stared at her. I needed the building breach to occur, she said. I didn't need 24 armed men on the grounds. He put his coffee cup down on the windowsill beside him with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who does not trust himself to hold things right now. You spoofed the abort signal before the breach started, 12 minutes before Doyle's team entered the loading dock. So you knew the timeline precisely enough to, He ran a hand over his face. How long have you been running this operation? Not from this building, total. She paused. 14 months. 14 months. He let that number sit between them. 14 months, which was roughly when Caldwell had started passing information, which was when the whole chain had begun. You've G-gay on this since the beginning. Since 3 weeks after the beginning, she said, when the first indicators surfaced. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before on people who were recalibrating not just a situation, but an entire framework. Garrison, he said, you keep using the name, but Caldwell gave us the employer, not the name Garrison. You've been using Garrison like it's a specific person. She said nothing. Who is Garrison? Webb said. The question sat in the air between them, with a weight that she recognized and had been preparing for, in the quiet way she prepared for everything. She looked at Webb, at 19 years of service, and 23 years of marriage, and the particular integrity of a man who did his job because he believed in what the job protected, not because of what it paid or what it proved. She made a decision. Garrison is the name of a program, she said carefully, not a person. It's a designation for a specific type of deep access intelligence asset, an asset embedded inside military infrastructure over a period of years, cultivated by a foreign-controlled network operating through civilian financial leverage. She paused. Caldwell is one of at least 9 active Garrison assets currently identified within domestic military installations. Webb went very still. 9, he said, that we know about. That we know about, he repeated. The words came out slowly, the way words do when a person is stacking them carefully, because the alternative is to let them come out all at once in a way that isn't useful. You're telling me there are at least 8 more people like Caldwell in installations like this one, right now? Yes. And the operation tonight, containing this breach, getting Caldwell's testimony, the evidence chain, was phase 2 of a larger network operation, she said. Caldwell's testimony, combined with the documentation from Doyle's operation, gives us 2 more active assets by name. The financial trails give us potentially 4 more. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the blizzard was beginning, barely, imperceptibly, but beginning, to lose some of its force. The howling at the windows had dropped half a register. Somewhere between 05 and 07, the weather would break enough for vehicles, and then for air traffic, and Fort Kavik Medical Center would be connected to the world again after the longest night it had ever had. You said 14 months, Webb said. Yes. You've been living inside this operation for 14 months. Different covers, different locations. This was the 4th. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she could see the thing he was deciding, not whether to ask the question, but whether the asking of it was fair, whether she owed him an answer, whether the answer would change anything. Are you okay? He said. Of all the things she had been prepared for, it was not that. She looked at him. At the simple, direct sincerity of the question, offered without ceremony and without expectation, by a man who was asking it because he genuinely wanted to know, and not because he wanted anything from the answer. I'm functional, she said. Jake's not what I asked. She held his gaze. Something behind her eyes shifted, very slightly, in the way things shift when a wall that has Jigay doing its job for a long time takes a hit from an unexpected direction. Ask me in about 6 months, she said. He nodded. He didn't push it further. He picked his coffee back up, and they stood in the corridor outside the ICU, and the blizzard pressed against the windows with slightly less fury than before, and neither of them said anything for a while. It was, she thought, one of the more honest silences she had experienced in the last 14 months. At 05:40, Carver woke up and asked for his phone. Sandra told him his phone was in his locker, and his locker was on the first floor, and he was not going to his locker. And Carver said he needed to call his mother, and Sandra said his mother was going to find out he was fine when he called her himself in approximately 4 days when he was discharged. And Carver said 4 days was too long, and Sandra said that the duration of his recovery was directly correlated to how much he argued with her, at which point Carver stopped arguing. Webb reported this exchange to Ava with the tone of a man relating good news, which it was. Tate was asleep again, which Sandra had called a victory. The 4 ICU patients remained stable, sleeping through the tail end of the longest night the hospital had seen. Dr. Sims had completed 2 additional patient checks and was in his office doing paperwork with the focused energy of a man who processes stress through productivity. In the records room on the 2nd floor, a forensic inventory was underway. 2 of the more detail-oriented junior Marines, directed by Webb, carefully documenting everything Caldwell had accessed and copied, building the physical component of the evidence chain that would accompany his testimony. They worked in silence and with a thoroughness that Webb had specified in terms that left no room for shortcuts. This was not going to be a case that fell apart on procedure. In the room where Doyle was secured, nothing moved. No talking, no pacing. He had gone quiet after the conversation through the door and had apparently decided that quiet was the correct strategy, which was the first decision he had made all night that Ava had no argument with. The 11 other members of his team were distributed across 3 separate rooms on the 1st floor, secured and monitored, and with 2 exceptions had said nothing of use since being contained. The 2 exceptions were a man named Dressler, who had not stopped talking since being zip-tied and had provided a detailed and largely unhelpful account of his personal grievances with the operations planning, and Briggs, the 12th man, the one who had run, who had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall with his wrists secured to a radiator pipe, and who was snoring with a peaceable thoroughness that suggested his conscience was either very clear or very dormant. Ava sat in the break room again, not because she was tired, because it was the best position in the building for monitoring multiple corridors, a fact she had identified on her 2nd day and which had informed her decision to take her breaks here with consistent predictability. The book was still on the table. She had not looked at it once in 4 hours. She looked at it now. The page it was open to was chapter 14. The main character was in the middle of a decision that felt very large and was probably about to turn out smaller than anticipated, the way fictional decisions usually did. She had been reading this book for 3 weeks and had finished it twice and started it again both times because she had learned a long time ago that reading the same book was less about the book and more about having something familiar in your hands. The door opened. She knew the footsteps before the door finished swinging. Reyes. He sat down across from her, and this time he didn't have coffee, just himself. And the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen from him before. Deliberate and careful in carrying something he had clearly been working up to. "I talked to Cortez," he said. He told me what Doyle said, about the supply wing, about what else might be shipped through a facility like this. He watched her, and I've been sitting with it for about 40 minutes. She waited. "The pharmaceutical shipment was real," he said. "You confirmed that, but Doyle's employer didn't send 12 men in a year of planning for pharmaceuticals, and you were embedded here 3 weeks ahead of their arrival. And the people waiting on the access road," he stopped. "What was actually in the supply wing?" She looked at him. He was 24 and he was sharp, and he had earned a lot of things tonight, and she was weighing the specific cost of each of them. "Do you have clearance?" she asked. "No." "Then I can't tell you." He sat back. He wasn't angry. He was frustrated in the way intelligent people are frustrated when they can see the shape of something clearly and are told they're not permitted to name it. "Is it something that affects the safety of the people in this building?" "Not anymore." Not anymore meaning it did. Not anymore meaning the threat to it has been contained. She closed the book. "Reyes, some things exist above the level of need to know for a reason, and the reason isn't bureaucratic self-protection. The reason is that certain information, widely held, creates more vulnerability than it prevents. He chewed on this. And you believe that? I've seen what happens when it's not true. She looked at him steadily. I've also seen what happens when it is. Both things are real. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the 14-month operation, multiple covers, multiple locations. He paused. This was the end game. Tonight. This was what the whole thing was building toward. One phase of it, she said. Garrison's employer. She said nothing. Wherever you're going after here, he said slowly, it's not over. It's not over, she confirmed. Something crossed his face. Concern. And the awkwardness of expressing concern for someone who has made every effort to seem like concern isn't applicable. He pushed through the awkwardness. You're one person. Usually. That doesn't bother you? It's the job. Stop saying that. His voice came out sharper than he intended. He dialed it back. I'm serious. Stop using the job as the answer to every question about whether you're... He stopped again, looked at the table. Whether any of this is sustainable for a person. She looked at him for a long moment, at the genuine, unconcealed worry of a 24-year-old who had known her for 4 hours and was worried about her anyway, because that was the kind of person he was. It hit her in a place she had not been expecting to be hit tonight. Danny, she said. He looked up. The fact that you asked that question, she said, is why you're going to be very good at whatever you decide to do with your career. She paused. The job can be the answer for a long time before it stops being sufficient. I'm aware of where I am in that timeline. He absorbed this. Are you close to the end of it? She thought about the city 7 time zones away, about a handler's voice giving her a location and a target and an implied timeline before she had slept or eaten or fully processed a 4-hour operation in an Alaskan blizzard. She thought about the book she had read twice. She thought about Webb asking, are you okay with the simple directness of a person who actually meant it? Getting there, she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 14 months. The radio on the table crackled. Webb's voice. Cole, weather window is opening. Backup convoy is 40 minutes out. She stood up, picked up the radio. Copy that. She looked at Reyes. He was watching her with the expression of someone who is memorizing something. The way you memorize the last page of a letter you know you won't be able to keep. Go back to your post, she said, not unkind. 40 minutes and you'll have more people in this building than you'll know what to do with. Brief them clean. Everything you saw, everything that happened, straight account, no gaps. Your commanding officer will handle the rest. And you? I'll be on a transport. He nodded. He stood up. At the door, he stopped. The next place you go, he said, whatever it is. She waited. Come back from it, he said. It was not a complex sentence. It was not strategic or calculated. It was just a young man saying the true thing, directly because he hadn't yet learned all the ways people learn to not say the true thing directly. She had unlearned all of those ways 14 months ago and was not sure she had put all of them back. Working on it, she said. He nodded once and left. She stood in the break room alone, and outside the window the blizzard was pulling back. Not gone, not forgiven, but retreating with the slow, heavy reluctance of something that knows it has lost the night. Gray was starting at the edges of the dark, the particular gray that comes before light in Alaska, the color of something deciding whether to begin. She picked up her jacket from the chair beside the door, the jacket that had a name badge clipped to it that said, Ava Cole, nurse, trauma unit, in clean black letters on a white laminated card. She unpinned the badge. She turned it over in her fingers once. Then she set it on the table, face down, next to the unfinished book. She put the jacket on. She walked out of the break room into the corridor, and the lights were all on now, full and flat and institutional, and the hospital around her was waking up, not loudly, but with the tentative, cautious energy of a place that had been through something and was checking its own pulse. She had exactly 40 minutes before the convoy arrived, and she intended to spend every one of them making sure that when it did, everything that needed to be in order was in order, and everyone who needed to be protected was protected, and the chain of evidence that had taken 14 months to build was intact and documented and unassailable. She walked, and somewhere behind her, in the break room, the name badge sat face down on the table, and the book sat open to chapter 14, and the coffee cup Reyes had brought her was still half full and going cold. And the whole quiet geometry of a life that had been lived under a name that wasn't her own sat exactly where she had left it, waiting for no one. The convoy arrived 38 minutes after Webb's call. 3 vehicles, 2 military transports, and a black SUV that had no markings and no plates that belonged to any agency with a public name. They came through the cleared access road with the deliberate, unhurried movement of people who had been briefed and knew exactly what they were walking into. The blizzard had pulled back to a manageable hostility, still cold enough to hurt, still throwing snow sideways, but no longer the full wall of white obliteration that had sealed this building off from the world for the last 5 hours. Ava watched them arrive from the window at the end of the East Wing corridor. She had positioned herself there not for sentiment, but for practical reasons. This window gave her a clear sight line to the access road and the vehicle approach, and she had learned a long time ago that you verified everything, even the things you were expecting, especially the things you were expecting. The vehicles were right. The count was right. The driver of the black SUV got out first and stood beside the door for 3 seconds before moving toward the building entrance, which was the correct protocol indicator for this specific operation. She had sent the protocol codes in the secure transmission 2 hours ago. Everything checked. She moved away from the window. Behind her, the hospital was fully awake now. Not loudly. There was a specific, institutional calm that medical facilities maintain even in the aftermath of serious events, a professional steadiness that the staff had pulled around themselves like armor. The nursing staff on the patient floors were doing rounds. Dr. Sims had emerged from his office and was making his way through the wards with the contained intensity of a man who needed to see every patient with his own eyes before he could accept that they were all right. Sandra was still in room 14. Not because Carver and Tate needed continuous monitoring at this point, but because Sandra had apparently decided that she was not leaving until she was satisfied. And nobody who had spent the last 5 hours with Sandra was going to argue with that determination. The Marines who had been on duty during the breach were at their posts, slightly dazed, operating on adrenaline and the automatic professionalism of training. They had been told to maintain positions in normal protocol until the convoy personnel cleared the building, and they were doing it. But Ava could see, in the way they tracked her when she moved through the corridors, that something had shifted in how they held themselves when she was nearby. Not deference, something more complicated than that. The specific attention people give to a presence they have recalibrated. She had felt that attention before, in other buildings, after other long nights. She had never learned to be entirely comfortable with it. She met the convoy in the main corridor. The man from the black SUV was named Peterson. She had worked with him twice before, briefly, in contexts that didn't survive documentation. He was 46, lean in the way of someone who maintained fitness as a professional discipline rather than a personal one, with eyes that did the same quick assessment of a room that hers did, for the same reasons. He looked at her and gave her the particular nod of one professional acknowledging another. Not warm, not cold, just clean recognition. Clean extraction, he said. Clean, she confirmed. Evidence chain? Complete. Physical documentation, digital records, device logs, and subject testimony, all verified and signed. He nodded. 12 detainees. 12. Secured across 3 first-floor rooms. No injuries requiring immediate medical transport, though I'd recommend evaluation for 2 of them before transfer. She fell into step beside him as they moved toward the security station. Doyle is isolated from the rest. He's cooperative in the sense that he's stopped being uncooperative, which is the version of cooperative you get from someone like him. Caldwell? In custody with Sergeant Webb. His testimony is the cleanest piece of the evidence chain. He gave everything: names, accounts, timelines, the full 18 months. Peterson glanced at her sideways. Not the quick assessment glance, something more considered. He broke fast. He was ready to break, she said. He'd been ready for a while. He just needed the door to open. You opened it. She said nothing, which Peterson took as the confirmation it was. They reached the security station. Webb was at the desk. Caldwell was in the corner, where he had been for the last 2 hours, with the stillness of someone who has run out of positions to take. He looked up when Peterson came in, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, but the recognition of an ending. The formal shape of consequences arriving. Peterson looked at Caldwell for a moment, then at Webb. Sergeant, your cooperation tonight is noted and will be documented in the official record. Webb stood. With respect, sir, my cooperation tonight was about 40% of what actually kept this building together. Peterson looked at him. I think the record should reflect that accurately, Webb said, and his voice was steady and completely without apology. Peterson looked at Ava. She met his eyes, said nothing. Peterson looked back at Webb. Noted, he said, and the word carried more in it than its single syllable suggested. He turned to the 2 agents who had come in behind him. Process the detainee. I want the evidence chain logged and transferred within the hour. They moved, efficiently, with the practiced coordination of people who did this specific kind of work regularly. Caldwell stood up when they came to him, and he went without resistance. And the last thing Ava saw of Greg Caldwell was his back going through the security station door, the particular set of a man's shoulders when he is walking toward the thing he spent 18 months running from and has finally stopped running. The door closed behind him. Webb exhaled. Long and slow, he sat back down. He put both hands on the desk in front of him and looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at Ava, and his expression was the expression of a man who has held a great deal together for a very long time, and is now, quietly, letting himself feel the full weight of what the night had been. That's it, he said. That's the transfer, she said. The rest takes longer. The rest, he repeated. 8 more assets. The Garrison network. Garrison's employer. He shook his head slowly. You're going to be doing this for another year. At least. He looked at the door Caldwell had just gone through. You said the city, 7 time zones. That's where the employer is? That's where the employer was 48 hours ago. And now? That's what I'm going to find out. He was quiet. She could see him working with something. Not argument, not doubt. Something closer to the specific difficulty of watching a person walk back into a situation you understand is dangerous, and knowing there is nothing useful you can offer except the acknowledgement that you see it clearly. Cole, he said. She waited. Whatever your real name is, he said carefully, I hope she's doing okay. It landed exactly the way he meant it to. She stood with it for a moment, letting it be real instead of deflecting it into professionalism. That was the discipline she had been practicing for the last year. Not the operational discipline. That one came naturally. The other one, the one that required staying inside a moment of genuine human contact long enough to actually receive it. She's working on it, she said. The same words she'd used with Reyes 2 hours ago. But the texture of them was different this time. Less deflection, more truth. Webb nodded. He stood up. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and meant what it was intended to mean. She walked out. Colonel Harwick was waiting for her in the corridor outside the security station. She had not expected this, which meant she had either underestimated him or he had moved faster than the situation required. And looking at his face, she understood immediately that it was neither. He hadn't come to intercept her. He had simply positioned himself in the corridor because he had something to say and had decided that the moment before her extraction was the right time to say it. "I made some calls this morning," he said, "before the convoy arrived." She looked at him. "Two people above my clearance level who were nevertheless willing to take my call." He held her gaze. "I know more than I did 2 hours ago." She waited. "The supply wing," he said. "The shipment. I know what it was." She didn't confirm or deny, she just waited. "Experimental compounds," he said, his voice lower now, contained between them. "Precursor materials, the kind that, in the right hands, could be weaponized in ways that would make whatever Doyle's employer was planning look like a convenience store robbery." He paused. "That's why the installation. That's why the remote location. That's why a year of planning." She said nothing. "That's why you," he said. "They don't send someone with your background to protect pharmaceuticals. They send someone with your background when the potential damage of a failed operation is catastrophic." She looked at him steadily. "Colonel, I'm not asking you to confirm anything," he said. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you that I understand what tonight actually was. Not what the report will say, what it actually was." He straightened. "And I want you to know that the people in this building, my people, they had no idea what was in that supply wing. They were protecting it because it was their post, because that's what they do." Something moved in his expression. Not quite pride, something older and more complicated. They didn't know what they were protecting, and they did it anyway. She absorbed this. "That matters," he said. "I want you to know that I believe that matters." She looked at him for a moment. At the 54-year-old man who had spent 31 years in service to something he believed in, who had come to work this morning and found his installation inside an operation he'd had no clearance to know about, who had had his authority and his knowledge and his command all quietly circumvented by people who were technically within their authority to do so, and who was standing here now, not with anger, but with something that looked remarkably like the determination to extract something true and worth keeping from a night that had given him very little he could hold openly. "It does," she said. "It matters." He nodded. Once. The precise, definitive nod of a man who has said what he came to say. "Safe travels, Cole." She met his eyes. "Thank you, Colonel." He walked back toward the command wing, and his footsteps were even and measured, and he did not look back, and she stood in the corridor and watched him go and let herself feel, for exactly as long as it took, the specific weight of being genuinely seen by someone who had every reason to resent you and had chosen something better. Then she moved. Peterson found her in the stairwell with her bag. The bag was small. It had always been small. 21 days in a remote Alaskan installation, and she had lived out of something that could fit in an overhead bin, because that was the other discipline, the one about never acquiring more than you could carry. She had been practicing it for so long that she no longer thought about it as discipline. It was just how she moved through the world. "Transport's ready," Peterson said. 2 minutes, she said. He looked at the bag. "You travel light." "Always." He was quiet for a moment. He had something he wanted to say, she could tell. The way he was standing, the slight adjustment of his weight that people made when they were deciding whether to say the professional thing or the real thing. In her experience, Peterson almost always chose the professional thing. Almost. "The secondary target," he said. "Garrison's employer, the city I gave you." "Yes. The intelligence on that location is 48 hours old. He moves." "I know. The network he's running, it's not what you've been tracking for 14 months. It's larger." He paused. "Significantly larger." She looked at him directly. "How much larger?" "The Garrison assets we've identified, the 9, they're one branch." He said it carefully, the way you say something when you know the weight of it before it lands. "Our current estimate is 4 branches: domestic and foreign infrastructure, financial networks, supply chains, and embedded assets going back not 18 months, going back 7 years. She held his gaze. 7 years. Before your involvement, before the program that trained you, before most of the current operational framework we've been working from. He paused. We've been tracking the branches. We didn't see the tree. The stairwell was very quiet. She could hear the building around her, the distant movement of the convoy personnel processing the detainees, the muted sounds of a hospital morning beginning, the last breath of wind against the exterior walls as the blizzard finally, reluctantly, gave up the night. 7 years. She ran the math that you ran when a number like that arrived. Not the operational math, the other math, the human math. 7 years of embedded assets. 7 years of information flowing in the wrong direction out of installations like this one. 7 years of operations like tonight's, in different buildings, with different people standing in different dark corridors, protecting things they didn't know they were protecting. How many installations, she said, that we're certain about? 11. Suspected? Closer to 20. She set her bag down on the step beside her. She looked at the wall. She was running calculations that didn't have answers yet, which was the most uncomfortable kind. The city you gave me, she said, that's a branch. That's where the branch connects to the trunk, Peterson said. The employer isn't the top. We thought he was. He's not. She looked at Peterson. You're telling me this now? I'm telling you this now because before now you were in the middle of an active operation, and adding this layer would have been a liability. He held her gaze without apology. Now you're out. Now you can hear it. She picked up her bag. She put it over her shoulder. She looked at Peterson with the flat, clear-eyed steadiness of someone who has just been handed a map that is significantly larger than the one they came in with, and who is choosing, in real time, not to let the size of it become panic. Who knows, she said. At this level, 6 people. And I'm being read in. You're being read in because of tonight, because of the 14 months, because the evidence chain you built on Caldwell connects to the branch in ways that the 6 people who know are still working through. He paused. And because you're the best we have for this kind of work, and everyone who matters knows it. She absorbed the compliment the way she absorbed most compliments from people in Peterson's world, not dismissing it, not accepting it as currency, just noting it and moving on. The city, she said. What's the timeline? Fluid. We have a window of approximately 72 hours before our best current location becomes unreliable. 72 hours from now? 72 hours from 48 hours ago. 24 hours. She had 24 hours. I need 8 hours, she said. Sleep, debrief, and a full intelligence package on the new framework. You have 6. She looked at him. 8. Peterson held her gaze for 3 seconds. 7, he said. We can do 7. She picked up her bag. Then we're burning time. She came through the ground floor on the way to the exterior door, and she almost made it all the way through without stopping. Almost. Reyes was at his post near the east security desk. He saw her coming with the bag and the jacket and the specific forward momentum of departure, and something in his posture shifted, a very slight stiffening, the physical signature of someone bracing for a goodbye that they have been anticipating and have not fully prepared for, despite the anticipation. She stopped in front of him. He looked at the bag, looked at her. 7 hours to wherever you're going. Something like that. He nodded. He was working something through. She could see it. The same quality of internal processing she had watched him do all night. The way he turned things over carefully before he let them become words. The thing Doyle said, he said, about what else comes through this installation. I've been sitting with it. And I think I understand now why certain things have to stay above certain clearance levels. He met her eyes. I don't love it, but I think I understand it. That's a significant thing to arrive at in one night, she said. It was a significant night. She looked at him, At 24 years old, in the natural intelligence, in the genuine moral seriousness of someone who was going to do real things in his career and was only at the very beginning of figuring out what those things would be. She had a thought, the kind of thought she rarely had in professional contexts because it sat at an angle to the clean operational lines she tried to keep around her choices. "Can I give you something?" she said. He waited. "Not about tonight," she said. "About what comes after tonight. What you do with a career and a skill set and the kind of night you just had." She paused. "There are programs, good ones, the kind that take people who can think under pressure and trust their instincts and follow a stranger into a maintenance shaft in the dark on 3 sentences of instruction." She held his gaze. "If you ever find yourself at a crossroads and you want to know what those programs look like, ask Webb. He has enough contacts to point you toward the right door." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that a recruitment?" "It's information," she said. "What you do with it is yours." He nodded slowly. The look on his face was the look of someone receiving something they will carry for a long time, not quite sure yet of its full shape. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." She was about to say something professional, something clean and concluding and appropriately detached. She had the words ready. She had always had those words ready. Instead, she said, "You're going to be fine, Danny." He blinked. The use of his name, the second time tonight, the first time without weight behind it, landed differently than anything else she had said to him. He swallowed. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I know." She moved. The exterior door opened onto 6 inches of fresh snow in a wind that had lost its fury but kept its cold. The light was the first real light of morning, pale and flat and without warmth, the kind of light that didn't promise anything except the fact of a new day. The black SUV was running. Peterson was beside it, waiting. She walked across the cleared path toward it, and behind her the doors of Fort Kavik Medical Center closed, and the sound they made, the specific institutional thud of heavy reinforced doors settling back into their frame, was the sound of one thing ending and another beginning, and she carried it in her chest for exactly as long as it took her to reach the vehicle. Peterson opened the rear door. She got in. The SUV moved. The installation reduced behind the rear window, the building, the cleared perimeter, the evidence of the blizzard's night-long assault on everything inside it. She did not watch it go. She was already forward-facing, already inside the next thing, already running the new math on the new map. But for exactly 4 seconds, between one thought and the next, she let herself hold what the night had given her. Not the operation, not the evidence chain, not Doyle's contained fury or Caldwell's hollow relief, or the clean, forthright respect in Harwick's voice when he said, "Safe travels." She let herself hold Webb, asking, "Are you okay?" and Reyes saying, "Come back from it," and the specific weight of being seen, genuinely and without agenda, by people who had every reason to simply be grateful and had instead chosen to be human about it. She let herself hold it. 4 seconds. Then she opened the intelligence package Peterson passed her from the front seat, and she began to read, and the world outside the window was white and cold and enormous and moving. And she moved with it, forward, toward the next building and the next cover, and the name she hadn't said out loud in 14 months. The woman who had been Ava Cole for 21 days was already gone. The woman she actually was, the one who had been built and broken and rebuilt across 16 years and 4 programs and more long nights than she could count, settled into the seat with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was walking toward and had made her peace with the walking. Not because it was easy, not because the math always worked out clean, not because there weren't 2 Marines in a room 14 with a broken arm and a concussion that would be healed in a month, but would live as a specific weight in her chest considerably longer. But because there were 11 other installations that didn't know what they didn't know. Because there were people standing at security desks with crossword puzzles and cold coffee, who were protecting things they had no idea they were protecting. Because there was a network 7 years deep that had been running in the dark for 7 years, and the dark was where she had always done her best work. And because someone had to be the person who went into the buildings before the danger arrived. She turned a page. The SUV moved through the Alaskan morning, away from Fort Kavik and toward whatever came next, and behind it the snow was already filling in the tracks, erasing the evidence of passage the way the world erases most things, quietly, without ceremony, without being asked. She had been erased from enough places to know that what mattered was never the tracks. It was what you had done before they were gone. She read, and the road ahead was long and cold, and hers.